Kennedy would have little time to savour his victory. The problems he had complained about during the election, the Cold War, Cuba, communism's appeal to developing nations, a stagnant economy and racial injustices would be his problems now. Kennedy's health remained as uncertain as ever. Having gone from one medical problem to another throughout his life, he believed his ongoing conditions were no cause to think that he could not be president, but whether someone with adrenal, back, colon, stomach and prostate difficulties could function with high effectiveness under the sort of pressure a president faced was a question that remained to be answered. With a Siberian wind knifing down Pennsylvania Avenue, John F. Kennedy was sworn in as the 35th president at noon on January the 20th, 1961.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
His inaugural address itself was one of the most memorable inaugurals. It is an exemplar of inspirational language and a call to civic duty. It began with a reminder of shared national values rather than partisanship.
We observe today not a victory of party, but a celebration of freedom.
Spoke of the need for all Americans to be active citizens.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
This sentence became one of the most remembered phrases of any inauguration. He asked the nations of the world to join to fight what he called the common enemies of man: tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
The torch had well and truly been passed to a new generation. In no region of the world was Kennedy more determined to encourage a positive image of the United States than in Latin America. Fidel Castro's summons to peoples of the Western Hemisphere to throw off the yoke of US domination challenged Kennedy to offer a competing message of hope. His presidency generated more documents and files on Cuba than on the USSR and Vietnam combined. During 1959 to 1960, as Castro, who had overturned the corrupt regime of Batista, denounced the United States as an imperialist opponent of progressive governments, the Eisenhower administration had planned to get rid of Castro with an invasion by Cuban exiles. Kennedy was encouraged to endorse the Eisenhower plan for ridding Cuba and the hemisphere of Castro and his government. Conflicting opinions from national security officials led Kennedy to have grave doubts about the plan. But in the end, he agreed to go ahead on the condition that no overt American military involvement would happen. The invasion, which occurred 3 months into Kennedy's presidential term, was a miserable failure, with 100 invaders killed and over 1,000 captured. The Bay of Pigs invasion disaster of Cuba led inexorably to the next Cuban crisis. This one had a far more serious ramification for world peace. On October 16, 1962, After much speculation by administration critics and press accounts that the Soviets were installing offensive missiles in Cuba, Kennedy received confirmation from a U-2 reconnaissance photos that this was indeed the case. None of the earlier Cold War confrontations, including the Korean War escapade, measured up to the dangers that now faced the Kennedy White House. He knew that his presidency would be finished if he could not quickly find a way of removing an atomic threat 90 miles from mainland USA. During the previous 3 weeks, there had been rumours in the American press about Russian military deployments in the Caribbean. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet Communist Party boss, had assured Kennedy there were only defensive conventional weapons in Cuba and just 10,000 Russian soldiers. That is what the president believed and told the American people in repeated public statements. 6 days later, Kennedy was forced to go on television and tell the world something closer to the truth. The 2 weeks of eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation between Washington and Moscow that ensued, while the rest of the world looked on, powerless, became part of Cold War mythology. Kennedy's principal challenge was to remove the missiles without provoking a full-scale war. There were agonised debates about how to react. The option of a surprise airstrike that was favoured by Kennedy's military chiefs to eliminate the missile sites gave the president pause. Ambassador to the UN, Adlai Stevenson, warned that an air raid would provoke Soviet reprisals in Turkey and Berlin and would risk starting World War III. He would later say, "You will never know the amount of really bad advice I received about Cuba. Most of it came from his generals. True to stereotype, they wanted to bomb the hell out of the island, then invade to enforce regime change to depose Castro." Kennedy's preference was for a blockade and negotiations that could persuade Khrushchev to remove the missiles from Cuba. What the Americans did not know was that in fact there were more than 40,000 well-trained Russian soldiers in Cuba, plus 9 armed nuclear bombs on aircraft, and orders to use them if the US invaded. Kennedy sent Khrushchev a letter pressing him to work out their differences. He said, "I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would, in this nuclear age, plunge the world into war." He insisted that Khrushchev remove the missile bases and other offensive weapons in Cuba that were threatening Western Hemisphere nations. Kennedy's speech to the nation and the world left no doubt that the United States would not tolerate this threat to its security. However eager Khrushchev was to face down the Americans, his understanding that an unbending posture would bring catastrophe to his people persuaded him to back off. He ordered Soviet ships proceeding towards Cuba to halt and turn around, and he agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States would pledge not to invade the island. As an afterthought, he demanded that the United States remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey in return for the Soviet Union dismantling its missiles in Cuba. Kennedy agreed to a public pledge not to invade Cuba, but insisted that the Jupiter swap, which he was willing to accept, not be part of the public exchange and only occur after the Cuban Missile Crisis ended. Kennedy had managed the crisis brilliantly, in contrast with Khrushchev, who was a blundering vulgarian. How, in the atomic age, could he have imagined he could send scores of ships carrying dozens of missiles and nuclear warheads thousands of miles from Moscow and place them on an island right next to the US without anyone noticing, or that the Americans would do nothing about those nukes once they were discovered? Kennedy had saved the world from nuclear annihilation. It would be his finest hour. Kennedy partly satisfied the national yearning to outdo Moscow in the promotion of national values by setting up the Peace Corps. On March the 1st, 1961, he issued an executive order authorizing the dispatch of American men and women to, quote, help foreign countries meet their urgent needs for skilled manpower. It would allow our people to exercise more fully their responsibilities in the great common cause of world development. The response in the United States to the proposal was all Kennedy hoped it would be. 71% of Americans declared themselves in favour of such a programme, and thousands of young Americans volunteered to share in the adventure of helping less advantaged people around the world. One measure of the programme's success was the antagonism it generated in Moscow and among some third world citizens. They complained that the Peace Corps was nothing more than a propaganda trick that would allow the CIA to plant agents in Africa, Asia, and Latin American countries. Kennedy understood that the Corps would help combat Soviet depictions of the United States as a typical capitalist country entirely self-interested. The Peace Corps proved to be one of the enduring legacies of Kennedy's presidency, as with some American domestic institutions like Social Security and Medicare, the Peace Corps became a fixture that both Democratic and Republican administrations alike would continue to finance for over 60 years. The insurgency in South Vietnam, supported by the North's communist regime, had been ongoing for several years, and it seemed likely to topple the pro-Western government in the South unless Washington bolsters its rule. In 1961, Kennedy told advisors that before he would consider sending ground forces into the country, he wanted, quote, indigenous forces used to the maximum, and intended to use air and sea power to the maximum before he would consider introducing infantry units. America's involvement was to be a last resort. The conventional wisdom in Washington was that the United States could not afford to abandon Vietnam. The faith that the US has the will and the capacity to deal with the communist offensive in that area would be lost. This was the so-called domino theory that one country after another would topple to communism if the US did not defend South Vietnam. Kennedy was profoundly sceptical about an overt American military response. However, he also believed that allowing Vietnam to collapse was too politically injurious to America's international standing. The result was an increase in US military advisors in Vietnam from about 800 to over 16,000 during the next 2 years of Kennedy's presidency. At press conferences in 1962, when asked about Vietnam, Kennedy consistently played down the United States' activities there, refusing to acknowledge that US forces had entered into an undeclared war. In one particularly eye-opening piece of footage, Kennedy is questioned by a reporter about whether US involvement in Vietnam was more extensive than previously acknowledged by the White House. Kennedy dissembled with a statement so partial and evasive, without actually being a lie, that it should be studied as a classic example of political dishonesty. You could almost see Kennedy working out in his head how to mislead the journalist. There is some speculation on what the subsequent path of the American intervention in Vietnam would have been had Kennedy not taken a fatal trip to Dallas in November 1963. Some 60 years on from a sunny day in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, that changed the course of American history, the mystery and dispute around Kennedy's visit that day continues to resonate in a bitterly divided nation. Conspiracy theories still swirl 6 decades later. The presidential limousine turned off Main Street at Dealey Plaza at around 12:30 p.m. As it passed below the Texas School Book Depository, a gunfire suddenly erupted from a window on the 6th floor, sending onlookers diving and running. Bullets struck the president's neck and head, and he slumped over toward Jacqueline. Governor Connolly was also shot in the back, but survived. The presidential car sped off to Parkland Memorial Hospital, a few minutes away. A Catholic priest was summoned to administer the last rites, and at 1 p.m, the 46-year-old Kennedy was pronounced dead, sending shockwaves around the world. In Britain, Big Ben tolled every minute for an hour, and lights dimmed in Piccadilly Circus. In Germany, 60,000 West Berliners held an impromptu torchlight parade. A witness was able to give police a description of the shooter, and Lee Harvey Oswald was subsequently arrested in a matter of hours after shooting a police officer. 2 days later, hundreds of reporters crammed into the police headquarters where Oswald held a bizarre press conference and was subsequently shot dead on live television by a nightclub owner, Jack Ruby. Thousands of books, documentaries, podcasts, TV shows, and Hollywood movies have been dedicated to these events and the shockwaves it sent around the world. And yet, the more information that emerges, the more doubt over what really happened grows. No other event has spawned as many conspiracy theories. The fascination with JFK's death is fed by different factors. If you think of Kennedy, then he is the iconic president for most people. He was the first television president. There's also the fact that this horrific event was caught on film. The Zapruder film, 26 seconds of silent 8mm footage, was captured on a home movie camera by Dallas dressmaker Abraham Zapruder. The image of Jackie Kennedy in her pink suit crawling across the back of the car is emblazoned on the memory of anyone who has seen it. Most of all, though, the continued fascination with JFK's assassination is likely due to the enduring mystery surrounding it. A year after JFK's death, the Warren Commission's report, instructed by President Lyndon B. Johnson, published its findings, which concluded that Oswald had acted alone to kill Kennedy, firing 3 bullets from the 6th-floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. The second and third bullets hit the president from behind, with the third killing him. The report dismissed any notion that what happened was part of any conspiracy, domestic or foreign, to assassinate President Kennedy, and it concluded that Jack Ruby shot Oswald 2 days later as an act of so-called patriotism. 2 million condolence letters were sent to Jackie Kennedy following her husband's death. The term Camelot is often used to describe his presidency, reflecting both the mythic grandeur accorded Kennedy in death and the powerful nostalgia that millions feel for that era of American history. While due to his short reign, achievements were thin on the ground, saving the world from the nuclear abyss is clearly the most important work any president could do. This also led to the first nuclear test ban treaty. He laid the ground for civil rights legislation that would be passed after his death, and he ensured the US would get to the moon. His was a remarkable life, and while remembered as much for his untimely demise and his soaring rhetoric, there is no doubt John Fitzgerald Kennedy was a history maker